Okay, so this afternoon I'm going to speak to you a little bit about real-time operations. The agenda item could be a little bit misleading. As we spoke earlier, we do have payload developer interface training that we do to really explain to you and train you in the interfaces with the POIC cadre that you'll have in real time. That training is very tailored, and it's tailored specifically to your ops concept and the needs that you'll have in interfacing with the cadre. So rather than focus in that area, I'm going to talk about just a few things that are global to you regardless of what you do operationally in the real-time environment. So the next slide, please. We're going to talk about your payload developer real-time support when we're looking to see you on console, operations change requests, and payload anomaly reports. Next slide, please. So our real-time operations processes are documented in Payload Operations Handbook Volume 2. Volume 1 has your pre-increment stuff, all of your development stuff. Volume 2 has your real-time processes that you'll follow. That also can be found on the Payloads 1 server, and we did give you instructions for how to get your account in the previous slide, and your PM can help you with that as you need assistance. As far as payload developer support during real-time operations, we are expecting the payload developer to sit console during specific operations. Anytime you have scheduled crew operations, if you have an item that's on a task list, it's not necessarily hard scheduled on the crew timeline, but it's out there and available for the crew to do on a list that we have put on board. If you've got ground interaction that's required with the crew during that time frame, we'll look for you to be on console then. We can tell the crew we need to give the payload developer a couple of hours or an hour's notice to get into console, so we can give you that kind of heads up. We're also looking for you to support during any hazardous or critical operations that you may have scheduled. We did talk earlier when we talked about the ground command procedures, the fact that you can relinquish responsibilities for monitoring and even command and control to your payload during quiescent or standby type activities. And we also talked about the two items that were required there for us to be able to do that. We need the payload regulation, which authorizes us to do that work, specifically laying out the conditions in which you want us to do that command, do any specific commanding for you, or if there's a particular telemetry parameter you want us to monitor and you just want us to give you a call, all that kind of stuff we want to have documented so that we respond in the way that's most appropriate for your hardware and your science. And just as a side note, if you are looking for us to do those types of activities for us, you do need to have those parameters identified in PDL and part of the CNDH data set so that we have access to that data. Next slide. Okay, operations change requests are really your means of making any type of change to your flight operations products that you've developed pre-increment. So your crew procedures, ground procedures, if you have a change to the payload regulation or you find something as you've gone through your operations that you do want to relinquish control to the POIF2, that would give you an opportunity to do your payload regulation and update the ground command procedures to provide us with the appropriate data. If you have any changes to your scheduled crew activities, those types of things would come in on an operations change request for us to evaluate and then make the appropriate updates to that product and get that product on board for the crew to use, or available to the ground team if it's ground command procedures or regulations in those cases. There are time frames that we do need you to submit those operations change requests. That's really quite dependent on the magnitude of change that you're making and the complexity of it and the type of product that you're changing. You'll find we've got a matrix in POH Volume 1 that goes into explicit detail based on product and complexity as to what time frame. We do need you to submit that paperwork prior to your scheduled operations so that it can be appropriately reviewed and dispositioned and products updated and put on board. We do request, however, that if you are going to ask for more crew time or more resources that are outside or above and beyond what's documented in your IDRD, that you go ahead and pre-coordinate that with the lead increment scientist and the increment payload manager before you submit that OCR. If we see changes come into that effect, the first thing we're going to do is go back and talk to our increment payload manager and our lead increment scientists to make sure they are in concurrence with that before we proceed and actually release the product for review. Next slide. Another documentation method that hopefully you won't have to experience, but you may very well, is the payload anomaly report process. Payload anomaly is really an unexpected response that you receive from your payload hardware during nominal operations. So it's a real-time document that we use to collect those anomalies and summarize what those anomalies are. The PD is responsible for documenting it and analyzing the available data and make available any further troubleshooting plans that you need to implement to go further investigate the problem. Once the problem is well understood, to develop those recovery plans and get those into the process. If you do need additional crew time to do troubleshooting or recovery, once you understand that and you have your plan well laid out, you'll submit an operations change request to make available the procedure that we'll need to use and also request the amount of crew time that'll be required to accomplish that procedure. You'll be responsible for updating that PAR throughout the process of the anomaly resolution until you are ready to close that PAR. And in the event that it does seem to be, or you're concerned that it may be related to some systems interface with your payload developer, then the payload program office can assist you in establishing the appropriate interfaces with those systems owners to help further troubleshoot that anomaly, find out where that anomaly does reside, and help you figure out how to recover from it. If you do experience an off-nominal condition on orbit, our primary focus is going to be to safe the vehicle and to safe the crew. Once we have assured that we are in a safe configuration, you still have time scheduled for your payload on the timeline, then we'll work with you to do some further troubleshooting or help you do operations that may provide you data that can help you in your subsequent analysis as time is available. Next slide, please. Okay, so the second part of my pitch is going to be really focused in on the real-time management increment team structure. So these are some management teams that you may hear about as you go through your real-time operations, and we'll talk about those. So next slide. The first one is the ISS Mission Management team. They're responsible for providing the programmatic oversight and decision authority for real-time operations as they go on behalf of the ISS program. There are really three areas that you'll see in the IMMT. You've got your IMMT chair, who is obviously responsible for the final decision-making authority and how we're going to implement real-time and near real-time anomaly resolution on behalf of the ISS program. There's an integration responsibility, which is primarily managed by the MER manager, the mission engineering room manager, the increment manager, and the lead flight director. So once those decisions have been made, they're going to work to integrate that decision and get it worked into the real-time system. Next slide. The remaining members of the IMMT, they're really representatives to that team, and they're responsible for bringing forward any impacts based on decisions that are made by the IMMT to their particular discipline. So the important thing really to carry away here is that the payloads office is represented by the increment payload manager, who is in George Norris's office. So he'll be representing your payload to the IMMT. Next slide. We also have the increment research team. This team, Rod Lofton talked about maybe just a little bit this morning. He talked about the pre-increment part of the process. Well, this is the real-time part of the process. They've got the increment research team, which is a multilateral body that's responsible for coordinating the integrated science and prioritizing the requirements and prioritizing any replan that may need or may be required in the USOS segment for research requirements. They're chartered for coordinating science research activities during near real-time, and the post-increment assessment period. They're also responsible to ensure that all opportunities to increase science return are done in an optimal and equitable manner. They're led by the lead increment scientist, who's appointed by the Multilateral Research Program Working Group Chair, which is Rod Lofton. And they also have representatives from each of our USOS partners that participate actively in this team. That's ESA, JAXA, and CSA. They usually meet weekly and will convene special sessions as required based on what may be occurring during real-time operations. Next slide. Okay, the Increment Payload Real-Time Management Team, you'll hear talk about the triad. They're really referred to as the triad. That's because it's made up of 3 positions. One position is from Mission Integration, George Norris's group, one from Rod Lofton's group, the Research Integration, and one from Payload Operations Integration. We'll start with Mission Integration position, the Increment Payload Manager. They're responsible for the overall integration of the ISS payload operations for that 1 6-month period for that increment, and they are, as we said earlier, your representative to the IMMT. They're supported by an increment payload engineer who is the book manager for the Annex 5, the IDRD payload research plan. They also provide direct support to the IPM during the increment to help resolve any integration issues that may arise. And they weekly status the payload control board on what's going on with the payloads and the overall increment environment. Next slide. The second member of the triad is the lead increment scientist. That's from the Mission Research Group, Rod Lofton's group. They'll manage the research complement in an attempt to maximize the science return for each of the payload developers. They'll provide the integrated science prioritization decisions to payload operations as we go through our scheduling activities on a weekly basis, and they're also supported by the lead increment scientist representative who I'll talk about a little bit more in just a little bit. The payload operations manager is staffed out of Payload Operations Integration. They are our lead payload operations director in the pre-increment time frame, and once you go into real-time execution, they'll be the payload ops manager. They're responsible for ensuring that the planning and the accomplishment of the direction of the NASA payload operations is accomplished successfully. They'll work directly with the IPM to provide integrated responses to our overall scheduling and the execution of payload operations as issues arise. Next slide. Okay, so the lead increment scientist representative. This is actually a console position that's located in Huntsville, Alabama. They're staffed out of Houston, so they live and work here in Houston, but then they come to Huntsville, Alabama on, I think, 2-month rotations, and they'll sit console. They are our POIC cadres interface into the increment science team, so they have a good understanding of the research priorities that are there. So anytime the real-time team needs a priority call on the science that's ongoing based on things that are going on with execution, they do that on behalf of the increment research team. Next slide. The lead increment scientist leads daily what's called a daily science tag, and it's focused on your science and investigation operations. 2 topics that are primarily discussed are the science status, and they're looking for that to come from the principal investigators or their representative, the payload developer. And they really want to understand how things are going with your planned operations, if you've experienced any anomalies, and how things are going in general for you. They'll also bring to the table for you a status of what's going on with other systems activities or payloads, specifically if there's anything that's ongoing that may impact your future ops or may impact the way things have to be scheduled in the future. All science teams that are in real-time execution are expected to attend this forum. And as I said earlier, it's managed by the lead increment scientist representative, but the discussion is generally led by the LIS for that current increment. Next slide. That's it. Anybody got any questions? Thank you.